light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Today I just wanted to offer some thoughts and reflections on helping the less fortunate, the poor. I imagine most of us have, in driving around the cities and places in which we live, most of us have seen examples of someone standing on a street corner with a cardboard sign saying, donations, anything helps. What's called panhandling, I suppose, but basically asking for people driving by in their cars to toss out bills or coins or something. The problem that I suppose is equally well known is the people who engage in that kind of activity fraudulently, who are not in fact genuinely in need, but may dress and act that way and put up a sign seeking to get money for which they did nothing other than stand on the street corner with a sign. Some people would say that is money they don't deserve, that they are freeloading off the generosity of the public, that they are betraying the trust of the general public. I think it's a little bit of a gray area, so it's hard to say. But for myself, I'm more concerned, I guess, about the possibility of traffic accidents or the dangers of somebody moving around an intersection like that with cars going by. The accidents that could happen because of somebody becoming impatient over this and attempting to swerve around or something. It's soliciting donations at a traffic intersection, to me, is just an accident waiting to happen. It's a recipe for disaster. So that kind of exchange should not be going on there. All that being said, it still leaves us with the basic challenge of, so how do we help those who are in need? And, what if, heaven forbid, we ourselves are ever in that situation? I strongly suspect that the majority of people who are in those situations never expected to be. Never expected to be hit with so much misfortune in life that they would be reduced to standing with a cardboard sign along a road waiting for others' generosity to reach out to them, to fall upon them like rain from the sky. There's so many different variables and dynamics going on in there. I'm going to try to scratch the surface in the next half hour, but obviously this is, if at best, a beginning for a much larger discussion. And if we say homeless people, the homeless people are not always the ones on the street corners. Homeless people are elsewhere also. Some of the people, maybe a lot of the people standing with cardboard signs on street corners, according to their signs, claim to be homeless. Some of them are and some of them aren't. Some are collecting money fraudulently. I grew up in a working class community where there was a certain principle, I guess, an unstated rule, I guess, that there should be a fair wage for a fair day's work. That if you didn't work, you don't deserve to get paid. But that if you did work, you do deserve to get paid. Occasionally I'll run into people who want to restrict their generosity with the explanation that I worked very hard for my money. And I usually respond with, well, that person worked very hard also, and they're not getting the pay that they've earned. What's with that? How are we going to be part of a community, of a society in which this sort of fairness is maintained, not by accident or serendipity, by sheer luck of the draw, but because we make sure that our community remains a genuinely good community by enforcing principles of fairness, such as the person doing good work getting good pay, and the person who refuses to work being told, if you're hungry enough, this job will get you the money you need for your food. I don't think it's a fair assumption, though, that everybody without money is unwilling to work. I have heard of people who stand on street corners and collect money, who, when offered an opportunity to do work, have turned down the offer because supposedly they have learned that it's far easier to stand on the street corner collecting donations. One book I read on homelessness suggested that there was even someone who was making $50,000 or $60,000 a year this way, because somehow he managed to figure out patterns of human behavior so that he was getting that much in donations simply by standing on a street corner with a cardboard sign. Is that right or wrong? I wonder if he isn't accumulating lots of negative karma for himself. But the point is not to be judgmental and say who is and who isn't and point fingers. The challenge in figuring out how to respond to those who have experienced misfortune, to those who are homeless, to those who are hungry or destitute or whatever. It seems to me one of the first problems with this is trying to talk about them as if they were a uniform category, when in fact each of them has their own story. I've run into some friends who insist that there is an enormous amount of mental illness, that some of these people are homeless because they're mentally ill and they cannot supposedly be helped, or because they're not seeking to be helped or not willing to be helped, they remain in their mental illness and consequently are essentially unemployable. And the only way for them to survive is by donations and generosity from the general public. Again, if we're treating it as a category, we take these real people, these unique individuals, and we reduce them to objects. And then we place these general statements around them as if we actually have any clue of who they truly are, when in fact we don't know any of their stories. We haven't taken the time to sit down with them and invite them to tell us their story. How did you wind up here? What do you believe in? What do you hope for? What do you wish for? If you could do anything, what would you do? A lot of that probably would be even foreign terminology to them, because they may be so struggling with issues of survival that they've forgotten to dream, and may in some immediate sense even have lost the capacity to dream or to aspire or to work towards something better because they've been stepped on by society so many times. Perhaps they legitimately did make some really bad choices and have never learned how to undo their bad choices. Perhaps they have gotten addicted to various coping substances, whether it's alcohol or drugs or smoking or whatever, and now the physical addiction is adding to their struggles, such that even if they thought of bettering themselves, even if they came up with a reason to better themselves, they now have more obstacles stacked against them than they did before. It would seem to me that, as with most extreme situations, that there is actually a fairly long road down to it. And there have probably been hundreds of opportunities to make other choices and to go other ways. For whatever reason, those haven't happened. Probably for a wide variety of reasons, those other choices haven't happened. In trying to reach out to that situation, it seems to me that every resolution that involves humanity, somewhere in it has to be some sort of manifestation or element of love. And one of the first steps in that would be to understand this is not just a homeless, this is Joe or Harry or Susan or Mary or Betty or whomever who experienced a divorce, the death of a spouse, a layoff from work, a misfortune in their housing situation, had a heart attack or a stroke, or now the medical bills are crushing, draining all of their resources until there's nothing left to even pay the landlord for the monthly rent to live indoors somewhere. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that one problem, one serious problem, can become an avalanche of overwhelming problems, leading us to say, how do we get out of this? And of course, for the person who's caught right in the path of this avalanche of mounting problems, it becomes so overwhelming that it's difficult to step back for a second and just think about how to put a stop to the avalanche, much less how to deal with all the problems that have already landed. When there's no food, clothing, and shelter, and people will say, well, there are food banks. Well, if you don't have an apartment or somewhere to cook, a lot of the food banks are handing out food that is not particularly usable to a homeless person. A lot of the food that has gone through food banks is often past its expiration date, maybe in a can, so then you have to make sure they have a can opener. I mean, things aren't matching up. It's trying to treat them as a category, so we say this is what we give to the category, instead of getting to know the person, the individuals, and saying to them, what's your story? What are your resources? What are you willing to do? Understanding that a lot of these people have some really deep psychological and emotional wounds that may require the sustained support of a community just to get them to a place where they believe that their problem is actually solvable. And once they begin to believe that their problem is solvable, or that their problems are solvable, because it's very often more than one thing all hitting them at the same time. They may need loving relationships in addition to logistics like food, clothing, and shelter. Most of us are so busy managing our own lives, though, that it becomes this complex question of what can I do to help, but I only have 5 minutes to give you. I don't have time to listen to their whole story, to be with them, to take them to dinner, to whatever. I'm running from this thing to that thing to that thing. I can write you a check, but I really don't have time to do anything else. As understandable as that is from a certain perspective, I have a hard time imagining how it could possibly be effective. If I were in the position of one of those people, or if at some point in the future I am in the position of one of those people, who knows what life will give at whatever point. Because as I said, a lot of people who are in that position never expected to be there. Families that never expected to be homeless. Workers who never expected to be laid off. And suddenly life pitches a curveball and they have to adapt one way or the other. And if they have not prepared themselves for this kind of development, if they have not contributed to a society that takes care of those who suffer the greatest misfortunes, then they will find themselves in that position with, well, quite simply without resources. And then it becomes this question of how do you stop the avalanche? How do you stop the nightmare? How do you break the cycle so that this doesn't go on and on and on for literally years? How do we get out of that? And it's fairly well known, I think, that the majority of the social welfare programs in the United States really don't do a tremendous job of making that bridge back to independence, because the amount that is provided is often based on outdated statistics that are not adequate to current demands. Some welfare agency, for example, may provide $200 a month for living space, but the person may be living in a city where there simply isn't anything that can be rented for $200 a month anymore. Or it may be in a neighborhood that is so unsafe that it becomes a question between sleeping outside safely in one part of the city or sleeping indoors in an unsafe place in another part of the city. As much as I think we need to recognize the people in need as individuals with stories, that perhaps someone lost a loved one in a tragic auto accident and has never been able to recover from it, that there was something of guilt and anger at this person being taken from them, guilt at, what did I do to cause this? If I hadn't asked them to come with me to the grocery store that night, they'd still be alive because they'd be sitting at home instead of getting in the car accident. any number of things. I think it still begins, though, with getting to know what was the person's story and who dropped the ball and when and how. Not so you can go back and blame that person, but so that we can understand, if we can figure out where the ball was dropped, metaphorically speaking, maybe we can figure out where to pick the ball up again. If what was needed is some better coping mechanisms. I've said to friends for years that I would be absolutely in support of eliminating the physical education in the public schools in favor and substituting for it psychological and relational education. That I think it is far more important to learn how to deal with the suicide of a friend or the divorce of one's parents than to learn how to play volleyball. To learn that who we become as adults has a lot to do with how we invest in ourselves as children. That during my teenage years, what I learned, ironically or curiously perhaps, one of the courses in high school that benefited me the most was when I decided to take a course in typing. And I've been typing at computer keyboards and typewriters and everything ever since. And it has been the one skill in high school that I've used more than any other. And it was simply a little elective course that I chose to take. In a similar sort of way, getting young people to think about where we're going and how do I equip myself with that journey. And if that journey includes, in spite of all my best efforts, if that journey includes all sorts of misfortunes from which it will be very difficult for me to recover, how do I prepare myself? How do I maintain enough presence of mind, enough centeredness of soul, that when everything has gone wrong and nobody is listening, that I am still able to find sufficient peace in watching a sunset or something, that I don't need to resort to violence toward myself or toward anyone else. That even from that moment, I can reassure myself that things still have the ability to get better. And if I am not in that position yet, to encourage friends and colleagues and coworkers and people I see at church or at whatever social club I go to, whoever constitutes my social group or my social circles, to remind them and to encourage them to remind me, and encourage all of us to be mindful together that the society and the community in which we live needs our support and our attention. That once we have stabilized our own position and we have enough, that at that point we really need to focus on whether our community is taking care of its most vulnerable members, whether the food and housing programs truly are effective and reward ambition and innovation, whether the resources that are available, psychological counseling resources, that whenever somebody is attacked in any way, psychologically, physically, verbally, that whatever resources they need in order to completely heal from that experience are available to them by some legitimate means. It is not reasonable, in my opinion, to go through being molested, being raped, being assaulted, being victimized by an uncaring system, and not have a need for some amount of psychological counseling. These psychological counseling doesn't mean you're crazy. It means that life has given you a seriously intense challenge, and that it is too difficult in those situations most of the time for a single individual without any help from anybody to be able to process and work through what was involved in that, to get beyond blaming yourself for the outcome if in fact there was absolutely nothing you could have done, and not to torture yourself with, if only I had this, if only I had that, and well, I should have done this or I should have done that. During my early adult years, when I was first coming to terms with being gay, I had a friend, very good and wise friend, offer me the advice that I should never should on myself, and which is a very amusing way to phrase it, I suppose. But ever since he said that, I've tried very carefully to watch my use of the word should. I should be feeling this. Well, I'm feeling whatever I'm feeling, and people feel whatever they feel. And I should have made this choice. Well, I didn't. People make whatever choice has been made cannot be undone. The question is, what choice do we make now in order to move toward more positive consequences? But if there is an emotional or psychological wound that is deep and difficult, if a loved one has been lost and cannot be brought back, if a sense of home has been obliterated and cannot be reconstructed, if a person has been harassed and teased and bullied, and maybe the ideal would be for them to reconstruct their self-esteem and their self-image, but the intensity of their experience makes it extremely difficult for them to do that without some sort of help. It's not that they're crazy, it's recognizing when this is more complicated than what I have the experience or the expertise to deal with. When it would be so easy to say, I'm sure it's my fault in some way or another, to instead, with the help of a neutral professional, to look at the situation and go, well, I made a choice, but so did they, and so did they, and so did they. And when all our choices came together, this is what it produced. But because I could only contribute 25% of the influence upon that choice, I cannot claim 100% of the responsibility and the accountability for it. The thing I guess I keep coming back to, though, is for all of us, instead of, for everyone who's able, I guess, instead of wallowing in excess, to find enough and then turn attention toward communal relationships and communal situations, people who haven't been heard and haven't been helped, just when their need was the greatest. And then later, when they act out in violent ways, and people act surprised and want to just quickly sweep it under the rug and not look at it again, instead of realizing this is not just a person in a category, the violent one who went postal, but this is a real, living, holistic person who needs to be healed, who needs to feel loved, who needs to feel and see and perceive and believe that there really is something better after this day has ended. That with each new day there are new possibilities for where things could go. And if life can pitch a negative curveball, life can also pitch a positive one. And there may be something that was completely unexpected that will show up the next day. How do we continue to believe in that? I suppose in whatever way works, because there's probably dozens of different ways that finding the faith, sometimes it's with working with another, sometimes it's becoming collaborators and partners in the success of our own lives. The person who feels that they do not matter to the world may be the one who has the answer the world needs. But in every case, the other thing we need to keep in mind is that this is always more than one issue at the same time. There is never only one issue, because in addition to issues of food, clothing, and shelter on a material level, you also have the issue of believing in oneself enough to try. The issue of finding hope within even the most discouraging circumstances. The issue of remembering that nothing is forever, and because nothing is forever, even the problems will change from time to time. Even doing absolutely nothing will still bring change. But in that change coming, we have the opportunity to welcome it and to interact constructively with it, rather than to insist that the cynical negative answer is the only answer. Instead, we can look at what's happening with life, what's happening with the relationships, what's happening with the person on the corner who has worked very hard, maybe not be working very hard while they're standing there with the cardboard sign, but perhaps they worked very hard someplace only to be shrugged aside by someone who was looking for a profit margin that was unrealistic. Instead of remembering that ultimately the money was made to serve the people, not the people made to serve the money. The whole business of economic exchange and money is about finding ways to distribute resources from where they're discovered, grown, found, located, to where they're actually needed. And to the extent that that doesn't happen as regularly or as reliably as it should, we wind up with a growing number of people who simply don't have enough, and our strength only holds out so long before people get absolutely too tired of trying to do survival and see if they can squeeze out an extra 2 minutes somewhere for all the stuff that orient around toward getting better, all the stuff that has to do with having hope, having faith, having love, with moving beyond the present moment and not allowing the present moment to define all of your life.